Hello and welcome to today's episode. I'm joined by Lauren Geraghty, a passionate leader in the education and public school space whose career has been shaped by a deep commitment to access and opportunity for all students. As Chief Strategy Officer of Communities and Schools of San Antonio, Ms. Lauren has spent years rethinking how systems can serve students best. Whether she's leading efforts to mitigate root causes in schools or partnering with overall communities to drive change, Ms. Lauren brings a sharp eye and an open heart to everything she does. Today, we're diving into what accessible change at the school and community levels really requires, and how language and access intersect in the work of policy, leadership, and prioritizing students in education. Hi, Ms. Lauren. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, good morning, Geraghty. It's my pleasure to just spend some time with you and to spend any time with youth in our community these days.
Of course. Was so lucky to have you here. So I'm excited to discuss the breadth of your experience in working in education, but I'd like to start with, of course, what you're doing right now. So can you tell us in your own words about the work you do at Communities and Schools of San Antonio?
Absolutely. So Communities and Schools in San Antonio, just a level set for folks, has been, as of this year, serving the San Antonio community for 40 years. So it's a really big year for us. It's a big anniversary. When we started in 1985, I wasn't with the team, but what we do have individuals with our agency who talk about those early years and what it was like as an unknown nonprofit trying to integrate into schools and just begging for an opportunity to test a model of integrated student supports. And now, instead of serving 4 campuses in one district, we're serving over 120 campuses across 14 different school districts. And that's just with the traditional model. So when I say traditional model, Communities and Schools as an integrated student supports provider does 2 really fundamental things on every campus. One is case management. We have kiddos who need the consistent caring presence of an adult to check in with them, to understand what some of the barriers or complexities they're facing day in and day out that are maybe impeding their academic success, right? Whether that's attendance or maybe it's academic struggles, maybe it's behavior complexities or social service complexities. So we make sure that we have staff embedded in that campus who are working with the administration, they're working with the teachers, the families, to identify students who need consistent caring support over the arc of the school year. And so that's the case management piece. But the other pillar of work on the schools is whole school support. And what that looks like is whether it's we have a citywide school supply drive called Stuff the Bus. You may go to an HEB in the coming days or weeks and see big yellow bins. This is the Stuff the Bus campaign that we run. It's across the city. It's in Uvalde. It's in different communities. And all of those school supplies pour back into our campuses. So it doesn't matter if you're a case managed student. If you need a pencil, if you need a binder, if you need pens, please come to the CIS office if you're a teacher or a student and get the supplies that you need to be successful in school. But it also looks like brokering partners. Whilst we're embedded in the school, we have amazing partners who do incredible work, run incredible programs that kids can benefit from, but they don't have the access to the students that we have. So we identify the student needs and we find those partners in the community who can help solve for those needs. Whether it's food insecurity, clothing insecurity, maybe it's an after school program because they need a safe space after school. So those are the 2 fundamental things that Communities and Schools of San Antonio does. And then we have a whole series of programs, which I call wraparound of our wraparound. And those are things like clinical mental health programs. We have programs at Haven for Hope. We have programs for opportunity youth because we know that youth experience complexity inside the school walls and outside of the school walls. And we want to be there to support those students.
Absolutely. And, just hearing you speak about the variety of programs and the initiatives that, CIS is a part of, it really seems to me as if working in this space is really one huge intersection between education and systems level change and access in so many different ways. So what really first drew you to working in this intersection? Was there a formative moment or any experience that lit that spark?
No, great question. And there was like, I think for me, when I started even college, I was still kind of lost in the ether of all the things that I could develop into or problems that I could solve in the world. But I always knew there was something kind of like in the how do I help humans, right? So in high school, I thought it was going to be going a medical pathway. In college, it was maybe an education pathway. And whilst I did trip into an education career, initially it wasn't within kind of what we would consider the education system. I was working for a nonprofit that was trying to help schools from kind of adjacent to the education system. They were trying to help fund different programs and create different innovations in the San Antonio community. And it was through that work, number one, that I really was an outsider looking into the education system and just like starting to understand what some of the challenges and barriers were. But in that work, I also joined an organization called Leadership San Antonio ISD, LSAISD. And through that kind of leadership cohort, I was exposed to like school finance and board management and teacher prep programs and curriculum development and family engagement, right? PTAs. And that was such like a illuminating program to be a part of. But one of the things in that program specifically catalyzed me moving down a different path. And that was that they were talking about suspension and expulsion rates. They were talking about school discipline policies and practices. And it was breaking my heart that some of the most disciplined scholars, some of the most disciplined students were our youngest students, our pre-K, our kinder, our first grade students had disproportionately higher rates of suspension and expulsion than our fifth graders or our seventh graders. And so we started unpacking that. What's the why behind that? What's the why behind complex little behavior? Why do they come into the classroom struggling with self-management, struggling with self-regulation? And as we started unpacking that, we noted that across the country, right, there were whole systems, whether they were independent school districts or state level systems that were taking an active approach to changing these suspensions and expulsions for littles. But in many cases, they were doing that without consulting with the teachers, without consulting with the school administrators. So then this option was taken off the table, but you still had students dealing with really big emotions and teachers who were trying to teach whilst managing students with really big emotions. So then I started researching, okay, so number one, why are littles having big emotions? And number two, how do we help teachers and school systems work with kiddos instead of pushing them away, instead of saying you're not welcome here, essentially, which is what you're doing when you're suspending or expelling a student? How do you help them see that they are still wanted, they are still valued, they are still seen and loved, but making sure everybody is safe, making sure everybody is healthy, making sure everybody is connected? And one of the interventions that was listed as a best practice was communities and schools across the nation, because it's a nationwide organization with an affiliate model of which I belong to San Antonio. So then I started researching more around like why littles do have big complex emotions. And some of it is that nobody taught them to name or tame their big emotions, but sometimes it's connected to much deeper, more complex issues that have nothing to do with anything that has happened within those school walls, right? When we talk about something called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that is what radically changed the way I saw interactions with all humans in every aspect of my life. But it absolutely drove me to a point of purpose where I knew from there forward, I needed to do whatever I could to make sure that less and less adversity existed, which was going to complicate things for children as they developed. And that adversity can look like neglect or abuse. It can look like over-incarceration of communities. It can look like mental health of caregivers or substance abuse complexities. But those are all things that now we have an evidence base for understanding how that impacts a child's ability to pay attention and to take in deep learning. And that complicates things for schools in a way that they can't control for. So working for communities and schools is a way for me to day in and day out make sure that we're providing that healing space for students, and being a part of that learning program and hearing just about those initial data points was what catalyzed my change.
Absolutely. And building off of that, you spoke, about education in terms of not just maybe what public perception of it is as just being like purely academic, but you also spoke about, social, emotional well-being and the health of these students, right? So how would you really define, I guess, educational access, especially through the work that you do, beyond purely academic metrics like enrollment or average test scores?
No, that's really important for us to move from looking at schools as only having one purpose, right? That academic purpose, to instead thinking back to almost like ancient Greece, where we're thinking about the development of the whole human. And what does that mean? We know now from research that if a child grows up in the context of a web of healthy relationships, they are more likely to perform well academically, to have better socio-emotional skills, to be less likely to engage in at-risk behavior, right? Because of that web of relationships, they feel connected, they feel safe, they have people who are helping them envision a future, to talk about a future. They're not trapped in what we call survival brain because they have food, they have shelter, they have love and connection. So that allows the brain then to really be in that prefrontal cortex of planning and goal setting and dreaming. And that's what we want for kiddos. So how do we think in terms of what is the web of relationships that our kiddos in our schools have? And that's external to the school and internal to the school. Are there teachers or coaches or other staff in the schools who really understand the power of relationships and connecting with students? And how do we measure that, right? So in many districts in San Antonio, they utilize a platform called Panorama. And in Panorama, you can measure things like student belonging, student connectedness, student well-being. You can also measure staff belonging and connectedness and well-being. So that is definitely one of the frames under which I see a lot of our current districts rethinking a holistic view of climate and culture and student and staff well-being. But I also think we can talk about just how do we have more opportunities for connection across the day and across the school year. As you probably experience yourself, it kind of feels like we're all just moving from one thing to the next as quickly as we can. And I can promise you that's how many of our educators and school staff feel, because there is so much to do and there is so much to accomplish within any given school year. But how do we think different about carving out space for connection and belonging? I do think that could be a way for us to rethink how we address some of the school safety issues that we see these days.
Absolutely. And you bring up like a really interesting point about the web of relationships as well, and how students obviously are the ones that are experiencing whatever, educational initiatives or things that we're putting forth. But also education is a field where there's so many different stakeholders, almost from parents to teachers to administrators, right? So in your experience, what does education practices that are truly accessible look like for all students in terms of not just students, but also teachers and communities?
Yeah, I think in general, we need to reimagine and then redesign, right? What education systems look like and do for current and future generations. It is not, I'm not trying to blame anybody, I'm not pointing fingers, but what has happened and what will continue to happen is exponential change. Exponential change in technology, exponential change in medicine and science, exponential change in, whether it's the corporate structure or the policy structure, like things move fast and ever faster every year. And what hasn't kept up with that, right, which is what isn't nimble enough to flex and adjust, is a giant Leviathan system like the education system. It's very similar to other systems, whether it's the healthcare system or otherwise. It's really hard for large systems that serve almost all humans in a country, right, to pivot and be nimble. But that's not enough to keep us from thinking in those terms and really encouraging people who are coming into the education system or who maybe hadn't thought about coming into the education system but could do some really amazing, interesting work for the education system to move it in the right direction. I mean, yes, obviously we want to improve the teacher recruitment pipeline and teacher preparation programs to be more relevant to today's youth and like preparing them for who knows what tomorrow's workforce needs, right? But we also need to rethink the early childhood programs, after school, weekend, holiday programs, because for children to have healthy development, they need access to safe, connected, and engaging places with caring adults. So that's kind of like at the systems level. How are we all really thinking about the web of relationships? Yes, but the web of spaces and making sure that kids always have access and are in healthy, caring, connected spaces. Then in practice, right, we need to make sure that we, from a both content and application opportunities, make sure that the kiddos have up-to-date content that is nimble enough to meet them where they are, right? But then we also need to have way more experiential learning opportunities, because when you're learning algebra in a vacuum and you don't see how that applies to X, Y, and Z jobs, it can really feel like, and I know I was guilty of this, of like, when am I ever going to use this, right? And with writing and the magic of words, as you know, Harini, if you don't see that having the capacity and having strong literacy skills undergirds every profession, regardless of which pathway you take, then it's really hard to care about making sure your comma's in the right place or making sure that your spelling is on point, let alone punching above your weight and actually stepping up to try to perform in a spelling bee, right? As you're well aware. So we have to think about how do we make sure that we can immediately individualize a student's education experience. One of the ways that we're doing that is we're working within a school system that has what they call a multi-tiered system of supports process. So at communities and schools, we have tiers of support. Tier 1 is whole school. Tier 2 is those case managed students I mentioned. And Tier 3 are students who need crisis intervention or more one-on-one, maybe it's clinical mental health support. School systems also follow a very similar pyramid of support, where Tier 1 in the multi-tiered system of support model is whole school. Then Tier 2 is those kind of group-based interventions or services, and Tier 3 are those one-on-one. So maybe those are for the students who have qualified for special education services or things like that. When we think about what a high-quality MTS system does, is it's not just about making sure that student is in the right academic pathway or making sure that student has the right behavior intervention or special education intervention. It's about all students having what they need when they need it in the right amount, right? So how do we make sure that in a world where we are all such unique, magical unicorn creatures, that the education system meets us where we're at and is able to really differentiate and provide those individualized services? So it's taking some of these best practices that we've seen, but still aren't system-wide, and making sure that they're system-wide.
And going off of that as well, Ms. Lauren, like you mentioned, really like the system itself, right? And the different levels of almost change that you're working through on different levels of systems, whether it's the school or like the education system as a whole. So building off of that, how do you navigate almost meaningful change between these long-term transformation and almost consistent effort that the system requires, along with the urgency of immediate student needs?
That is that's the push-pull, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you are as passionate as the individuals I work with day in and day out. They know that a student is hungry today, or a student is scared to go home today. But they know that their one support isn't solving for the root cause. I don't know if you're familiar with Carol Dweck. She is the person who's known for growth mindset, right? Her book, Growth Mindset. And she has this quote that sticks with me, which is, "Speed and perfection are the enemy of difficult learning." So whilst, yes, there are times we must move with speed, there are times we must act with urgency, right? to keep a student safe or to make sure that they have some food on their tummy so they can go to class and pay attention, right? It's hard to pay attention when you're hungry. We also can concurrently, because we're humans and we can do complex, amazing things, we can also work on root cause issues in the background. So, for an example, unfortunately, we know that in San Antonio, we have, out of all of the communities in Texas, the largest percent of youth who experience abuse and neglect in the state, right? We know that we have significant issues with childhood trauma and childhood complexity in San Antonio. So while we were, as a city and consortium of partners, launching this trauma-informed consortium where we were trying to make sure everybody is educated on adverse childhood experiences and what we can do collectively to reduce adverse childhood experiences and to ensure children have safe, connected, wonderful spaces for them and their bodies to develop in healthy ways, that's systems level work that takes time, right? The trainings that I give on adverse childhood experiences take 2 hours, but then implementation of rethinking how you approach your work, whether you work at a corporation, a nonprofit, the way I say is whether you have kids, work with kids, or see a kid at HEB, you need to know about trauma-informed care. You need to know about adverse childhood experiences and positive childhood experiences and the power of positive childhood experiences. But while all of that education is happening, while all of those neurons are connecting and firing, we have to make sure we're actually addressing the children who need us to help them now. So that's where a program like Handle with Care comes in. Handle with Care is a program in San Antonio whereby if a police officer is called to a home and there was potentially some traumatizing things that happened at that home, the officer has a protocol now to connect with the school district that student is in and say, hey, we visited Lauren's house last night. You're going to need to handle her with care today. It's that simple protocol. They don't share any of the details. Nobody knows what Lauren experienced when Lauren shows up for school the next morning. But if Lauren is acting different, they understand that something happened. If Lauren is maybe fast to anger, there might be more understanding and compassion because they know to handle Lauren with care. If Lauren isn't engaging, if Lauren is asleep at her desk, right? These are simple ways. And then you train the school so that when they get the call, it's not just, okay, well, we're going to let Lauren go about her day. It's, okay, let's make sure that the counselor is ready, that the counselor can talk with Lauren, that if we need to make a referral to Communities in Schools is ready. If we need to make a referral to one of the clinical mental health providers in the community, we're ready with that referral process and we're ready to go. So it's making things activate with a sense of urgency whilst also making sure that we as a community are addressing root cause issues. So that's an example of how you can do both simultaneously.
That's wonderful. And it's really also that overall community engagement as well, to be able to work with these students, work with these kids in the best possible way that also, accommodates to their needs and what they need. And in that, sort of particular situation, when we're talking about root causes and addressing root causes, how does your work center community voices in educational change, especially when discussing, how communities can work together to help mitigate these root causes that are adversely affecting students' educational outcomes?
So one of the things that I say pretty often is if you've seen one school, you've seen one school. Each school serves its own unique community, and that community changes over time, right? So even if this strategy or this intervention or this family engagement event worked really well 2 years ago, guess what? The community has changed, and the only way in which you're going to know is to talk with the community, is to connect with the community. The students are a part of the community, but their caregivers are a part of the community too. The local businesses, the local churches, right? So how do you effectively connect with, listen to, and then act upon the information that you get? So for Communities in Schools, we're really excited because we're an anchor partner in the Bexar County Future Ready Plan. So Up Partnership is leading the Future Ready Plan. It has a North Star goal of increasing the percent of students who graduate in San Antonio from 50 to 70% who actually then enroll in a post-secondary pathway, right? That can look like a certification pathway, an institution of higher ed. But as of 2 years ago, we were at 50%. And within the past couple of years of intentional collaboration and collective impact, they've been moving that closer to 56%. So we want to get to 70 by 2030, and all indicators show we're moving in the right direction. I bring the Future Ready plan up because a key pillar of how you do this is voice. And how do you listen to student voice? How do you make sure that they have the space and that they feel safe enough to share with you? This isn't working. Or this was great, but my sister didn't get access to that. I only got access to that, right? My cousin in the other school district isn't going to get access to this. They need that too. And then hearing community voice and caregiver voice and being really intentional about not just listening for the sake of listening, right? Not having totems, student totems or community totems who will sit on your board or sit on your advisory committee, but actually activating on their suggestions, their feedback, their wishes, and their dreams.
Absolutely. Well, that was a wonderful first half of our conversation. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to dive back in with our second part.
As am I. Thanks, Rainey.
Thank you.